In the wake of the George Floyd aftermath, I would like to say that justice has finally been done. The officer known as Derek Chauvin will be spending at least 20 years, or some sources may say that even more than 25 years, because he has been charged with manslaughter and third degree murder. And he's not the only one who's going to go to jail or prison. The other officers have all been charged with being an accomplice to a murder, so they're all going to spend their time in jail as well. So I'm glad that justice has been served. Of course, the whole protest was a tad bit messy, despite the fact that there were riots and rioters and looters out there who were destroying property and burning down buildings and, you know, taking stuff down after breaking into a couple of stores. And let's not forget something. Not all of these rioters were black. Some of them were mixed. Some of them were Hispanic, and a lot of the rioters were also white people, by the way. So, and funny thing is, when it comes to huge protests like this, you always have people who are actors. By actors, I mean pretend protests. There are paid protesters and paid rioters. Like they get paid money to infiltrate a protest and make the rest of the other people look bad by, throwing Molotov cocktails and burning and destroying property. Those are called paid rioters and paid protesters. This even occurred during Occupy Wall Street. You had paid protesters. A lot of the members of Occupy Wall Street were, of course, a lot of them were communists and anarchists and socialists, and the list goes on and on. Very few of them were actually law-abiding citizens who were actually American, but the rest, a lot of them were actually, anarchists, socialists, communists. The list goes on and that was on record. But you know what I also discovered that I thought was interesting about Derek Chauvin, the officer who had his knee pressed against um, George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes straight, was that he himself has had 15 complaints of misconduct throughout all the 19 years he's been in the police department. So that tells you right there that this man has received far too many slaps on the wrists. I mean, he's had too many slaps on the wrist, and they just kept letting him go. But he should have had his badge removed long ago, and he probably should have been arrested for breaking the law. And of course, suffice to say that, I mean, the police department was almost 20 years too late now. And the fact that these police officers acted like nothing wrong was happening, that tells you right there that they are all accomplices. And I'm glad justice has been served. And strangely enough, the fact that, not only was it that all articles said this, but this was also this information that I'm telling you was actually written in a couple of pages in People magazine. This is from the People magazine, which is a celebrity magazine, but they had a couple of pages dedicated to George Floyd. But if he could hear what I have to say, I would like to thank George Floyd for giving us a voice, and the strength to protest and have our voices heard in his wake. That is something I would definitely like to say to George Floyd. However, I will say this though: the paid protesters and these paid rioters, they're actors. They were actually staged and instructed to do this, all as a means of dividing the protesters and the "I can't breathe" movement. But I think the strongest voice of all was George Floyd's brother. he was the strongest voice in the protest. And I think it's definitely safe to assume that, without a shadow of a doubt, he may rest in peace, rest in power, and justice has finally been served, not just for George Floyd, but for all the innocent black people who were victims of police brutality, which were in the past racially motivated. But this one didn't have a racial component because it turns out that George Floyd was actually arrested for forgery, as well as the fact that he was allegedly accused of counterfeiting some money, walking around with counterfeit money. He had a counterfeit $20 bill. So he was allegedly accused, according to the People magazine, the pages that were written about him in People magazine. So, with that being said, I think it's definitely safe to assume that even though George Floyd apparently committed a crime, it wasn't a racially motivated thing at all. Because, as far as I'm concerned, black people aren't just attacked, are not the only ones attacked by police officers who are white. Because police officers, they kill others unjustly. Police officers have murdered white people, they have murdered Hispanics, they have killed even Muslims. Especially during 2003, like a Pakistani immigrant was actually shot execution style in the chest. This was 2 years after the 9/11 attacks. Now, that was a hate crime in itself, but this George Floyd incident turns out it wasn't a hate crime because he was allegedly accused and arrested for carrying, having possession of counterfeit money, as well as forgery. Now, like I said, in 19 years, the arresting officer Derek Chauvin himself has received 15 complaints of misconduct throughout all the 19 years he's been in the police department. So that right there actually tells you that there are red flags from the very get-go. But of course, it was ignored from time and time again. And with that being said, here's justice may have been served, and of course, in the aftermath, there were tens of thousands of protesters and rioters and looters who have actually been arrested. And it's a good thing that did happen. And need I remind you, not all the rioters and the looters were actually paid protesters, by the way. The white people who actually did all this were paid protesters, apparently, but I have a feeling it's not just about white or black or skin color anymore. But let's not forget something. This always gets media attention when a white person or even a Caucasian police officer murders a black man. It makes headline news because the black person is always seen, or should I say in this case, the black man is always seen as the victim. And need I remind you, a few years ago, 7, 8 years ago, when a black man murdered a white boy who was 17 years old, when news of this surfaced, that barely reached local news. That barely made it to local news. So apparently, that didn't get as much attention. That was around the same time, or even a couple months before Trayvon Martin was murdered. And black on black crime happens too often, almost every day in Chicago. Nobody reports or even comes up with a solution to solve the crime issue that occurs in Chicago, which has a very high crime rate, and not only when it comes to murders that involve firearms, which is known very popular when it comes to gun control, by the way, and it hasn't worked. It failed, as usual. But that's for another video. But let's not forget, when it comes to black on black crime, nobody bats an eye or even expresses a spark of outrage. When it comes to a black adult who murders a 17-year-old teenager who happens to be white, nobody cares about that either. If police officers murder a white guy, despite the fact that those same police officers are just as white as that the perpetrator or the victim, if I should say. Nobody even cares about that. I mean, just 2012, there was a white guy who was homeless. He was mercilessly beaten by two police officers, unrecognizable when he was in the hospital bed. They had to pull the plug after he had all these tubes in his in his mouth. And when he was announced dead, that only was around the internet, and that didn't even make it on CNN. Didn't even reach Fox News. And what's actually funny to me is that most people haven't even heard of this story. I mean, this was all over the internet, and still people didn't even pay any attention to it, not even for a second. So when a white guy is a victim of police brutality, nobody cares. When black on black crime occurs, nobody cares. And the black people who are living in those communities, they don't organize a march or a protest to express their outrage and their disgust with black on black crime. But when a black guy murders a teenager who happens to be white, nobody even cares about that either. And by the way, that was a very sad story when that 17-year-old white kid got murdered. That was very, very sad. I mean, he was an only child and the parents were grieving. I mean, it may have made more, gotten a lot of headline news if it was the story of Rachel Wade, who was involved in a love triangle against her rival, Sarah Lutterman. Now that made headline news. Of course, that started off as local news that in Florida, but of course that made a lot of headline news because it was a battle between two love rivals, and it was a love triangle that went awry, as I would like to describe it as. But you see, anytime you see a picture of an arresting officer, being exceptionally aggressive with a black man, I think it's safe to assume that it sparks outrage, and it's always painted as a hate crime. It wasn't. It was not a hate crime. It had nothing to do with race. And a lot of these protesters carrying around signs saying Black Lives Matter and, stop discriminating black people. It wasn't even about race. And it even said it in People magazine. I read it. It said that he was arrested for he was allegedly accused of counterfeit money. Now, you see, if George Floyd was a white guy, he still would have died. Because the reason why Derek Chauvin arrested him was simply because of the fact that he allegedly had counterfeit money. It was not a hate crime. It wasn't. I mean, just because you see a white police officer arresting a black man doesn't mean it's a hate crime 24/7. That's not what it means, and that's not what it's going to come down to. You can't always expect to see it as black and white, literally and metaphorically. It's not always like that. Suppose a black guy arrested a white guy. Does that mean it's a hate crime? No one would even say that. If an officer who was African American arrested a black guy, no one would even call it a black on black crime. So not everything has a racial component when it comes to arrests that are being made. It's not. And as a matter of fact, statistically speaking, you have it has been mentioned that the majority of crimes and murders that are being committed are by African Americans. That's statistically speaking, and I'm telling you this as a black guy. I'm not being racially biased here. That's just what they said. That's not coming from me. That's what statistics have said. And people keep throwing around this word like white privilege. And here's what I actually found out. There may have been white privilege that did exist. I'm not denying that. However, let's not forget something. When it comes down to it, if white privilege was such a thing, how come white people aren't the ones who generate the highest income in the country? You know who makes more money? You know who generates the highest level of income in the United States? Asians. Asians are the ones who generate the highest level of income. That's a fact. So, this thing about white privilege and, you know, um, an officer arresting a black guy always being painted as a hate crime doesn't make any sense. I mean, I've seen there was a video of there was a police brutality video of a black officer who actually arrested a Mexican kid or Hispanic. I mean, the way he tackled him and then he made him suffocate, then pulled him up by the shirt by the neck, and he arrested him. And he was using too much force. I mean, the thing is, like, he just tackled him and just dogpiled him when the other arresting officer was already behind him in handcuffs. And the kid was crying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." So, for the past 10 years, police officers have become sociopathic and they have been militarized and serving the community as robots instead of serving the community as human beings. Now, the fact that we have many police officers nationwide taking a knee in paying tribute to George Floyd, that tells you right there that police officers are not all bad as the media makes them out to be. Because, like I said in my other video, no one sparked any outrage when you had a black guy pulling up, walking up to police officers, while the police officers were eating their lunch in their car, and he shot them at point blank in the head. These police officers didn't even do anything, and there was a mass shooting, and all these police officers were white, and the mass shooter was a black guy. But nobody expressed any outrage. There was no protest from the police officers. I mean, where was the Blue Lives Matter march? And the media just totally brushed it under the rug after a few days. So with that being said, where do we draw the line and stop this nonsense with what's it called, the hypocrisy? I don't know. Only time will tell until America realizes that two wrongs don't make a right.